and glad to have you all here again. Glad to be able to commence our talks for 2023. There will be 8 of them from today through March 8th, and our first one today is on energy geopolitics, something which touches all our lives, and we're all very aware of every time we pass a gas station and see the price of unleaded in diesel. And our speaker will be Steven Stein, who you have certainly seen before, who's done great work, and I'm sure will do great work again today. Steven B. Stein has served as a full-time professor at Tyler Junior College since 1998, teaching history, government, and economics. From 1995 to 1998, he was an instructor of history at the University of Memphis. From 1973 to 1995, Professor Stein worked as a bank examiner and liquidator for the federal government and multi-state bank holding companies in Texas, Tennessee, New York, and Puerto Rico. Professor Stein holds a bachelor's degree in economics with honors from Texas Tech University and graduate degrees in history and finance from the University of Memphis and Rutgers University. He has completed graduate programs in political science, economics, Spanish literature, and theology from Texas Tech University, New York University, the University of Texas at Tyler, the University of Texas at El Paso, and the University of the South in Sewanee. Professor Stein was ordained in 1986 as a permanent vocational deacon in the Episcopal Church and has served congregations in Texas, New Mexico, Tennessee, and Mexico. Since 1998, he has served as the deacon of the clergy staff of Christ Episcopal Church right here in Tyler, just down the road. His wife, Lori M. Dow, is a retired prosthetist, and his son, Daniel, is the Deputy Director of the Office of Environmental Health and Safety at the University of Texas at Austin. And without further ado, here is your speaker, Steven Stein. Steven, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Crean. I need to congratulate Dr. Crean because last month he married in New York State, and somehow he obviously is on the right side of the weather gods. He avoided the snowmageddon of western New York and had apparently a wonderful honeymoon in New York City. So congratulations, Dr. Crean. And thank you, everyone, those here in the auditorium and those who are watching on the Tyler City channel and also through YouTube and Facebook. I want to begin by giving a little background about myself. I grew up in the oil patch in Midland, Texas, a place many people have driven through on their way to someplace else. And it is a place that is extraordinarily flat. The highest altitude in all of Midland County is 15 feet, which tells you it's a pretty flat area, part of the Permian Basin. And of course it's flat because it was the bottom of the sea during the Permian geologic period. My father was in the oil industry. He eventually became a senior vice president of Sun Oil Company. And so I grew up I was born in 1951, so I grew up in the 50s and 60s. And I can remember oil selling for $2 to $5 a barrel and gasoline selling for 10 cents a gallon. Now, that sounds very cheap, but keep in mind that gas mileage for the big land yachts that we drove in the 50s and 60s, and my father had I think the biggest one on our block. The gas mileage was about 9 to 10 miles per gallon. So that 10 cents per gallon eventually went pretty fast. Of course, the world has changed a great deal since then, though if you adjust for inflation, the price of oil and the price of gasoline is not that much higher than it was in the 1950s and 60s. Part of that is because mileage, the efficiency of automobiles, of vehicles has increased dramatically because of events in the primarily the 1970s and since then. I want to open with 3 brief stories that tell us a lot about the fickleness of the energy sector, how odd little events can affect the energy sector. And then I want to focus on 3 major geographic regions connected with energy and geopolitics, and then talk about a 4th, the really overriding factor that's facing the energy and geopolitics. I want to tell you 3 stories. I'll do it in chronological order. The first involves the island of Guam. Until 1898, Guam had, since the 1500s, been part of the Spanish Empire. It was not a very big part of the Spanish Empire. It's an island. It's only maybe a few hundred square miles. It's actually a small archipelago. And in 1898, as a consequence of the Spanish-American War and the Treaty of Paris of 1898, the United States secured control of Guam. Ostensibly, it was because Guam had a good seaport, and Guam has become an important part of the U.S. military establishment. But there was another factor which was not well publicized at the time that was the real motivation for the United States to take Guam. Of course, the great prize in the Pacific for the United States was the Philippine Islands, but Guam had its own value. That is because Guam, then and even today, is among the largest depositories of bat guano. Bat guano is the leavings, the deposits of bats. And the bat guano of Guam is particularly high in nitrates. And the U.S. Agricultural economy was expanding very rapidly. And as a consequence, we needed as much fertilizer as possible, and nitrates were also important in the processing of refined oil. And by 1898, refined oil industry, particularly in Cleveland, which was then the energy capital of the United States, was increasing. So we took Guam because of bat guano. Very important, very important. The second story I want to talk about came in, that was 1898. Second story I want to talk about came in 1943. And that involved the United States and Saudi Arabia. In 1943, there was a major conference in Cairo between Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and Chiang Kai-shek, the President of the Republic of China. After that meeting, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill met separately, but at about the same time, with the king of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Abdul al-Aziz, one of whose sons is still king of Saudi Arabia. Abdul Aziz was fathering children at the age of 82, which is quite a record, quite an achievement. So Abdul Aziz was scheduled to meet on board a British warship, first with Prime Minister Churchill and then with President Roosevelt. He met with Churchill, and Churchill, completely ignoring the etiquette and protocol of dealing with a Saudi Muslim, smoked all the way through the meeting. It's hard to separate Churchill from his cigars, but he smoked all the way through the meeting. And Abdul Aziz was very disturbed by that. He was very irritated by that. And second, oh, thank you.
Absolutely.
The next meeting he had was with Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a chain smoker. And Roosevelt decided that he got better advice. He did not smoke in the meeting. However, as he was being wheeled to the meeting, he was furiously smoking unfiltered Camels. I think it was 4 or 5 at a time, just to get his nicotine fix. And so he meets with Abdul Aziz. There's no smoking involved. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And as a consequence, after the meeting, the Saudis, who had oil had been discovered in Saudi Arabia in 1932, granted new concessions to Aramco, the Arab American oil company, and effectively shut the British out of oil production in Saudi Arabia. And because of the fact that FDR knew protocol better than Churchill, that's how that situation worked out. The third factor, the third story I want to talk about, I'll back up slightly. 1914, World War I starts, the Great War, when Europe committed suicide. And one important country in Europe, certainly in colonial power, was Belgium. And Belgium was very quickly overrun by the Germans. The Germans controlled almost all of Belgium, really until 1918. The United States initially was neutral. We entered the war formally, though we had been involved in the war before this. We entered the war formally in April 1917. Up until that, but one of the reasons that this was not even publicized at the time, but later examination of the archives of the State Department showed that one of the reasons we got into the war was because of the Belgian Congo. Belgium was a colonial power. Their biggest prize, their biggest part of their colonial empire was the Congo. Later, Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Belgian Congo, the Congo, did and still does have huge amounts of copper. The United States has a pretty good amount of copper. If you've ever been to Butte, Montana, you know something about Anaconda Copper Company and others in the West. But we needed copper. We needed lots of copper because the increasing industrial expansion, the need of copper, particularly in oil refining, in building pipes for oil refineries. So one of the reasons that the United States entered the war was to protect Belgium. The fear was if the United States did not enter the war, Germany would win. They would create a settlement in which Germany controlled the Congo. And the Germans would probably be glad to trade copper with the United States at a very high price. So because of Belgian copper, because of Congolese copper controlled by the Belgians and the fear that that was going to go under German control, that was one of the reasons we entered World War I. If you read President Wilson's address to Congress in April of 1917 asking for a war declaration, you'll never see any references to the Belgian Congo, but that was important. So those are three examples of how energy has affected the connection, the intersection of energy and geopolitics. I want to look today at three geographic areas to examine this issue. And then once I finish talking, which may seem like 2 or 3 hours from now, I'll take questions. I doubt there'll be any questions because I anticipate I'll answer any questions you might have. The three areas are Russia, Iran, and China. Now let's look at Russia. Russia's, of course, been in the news very unfavorably, at least from a Western perspective, since February of 2022, when they launched an invasion of Ukraine. Sir Max Hastings, the former newspaper editor and very well known historian, has won the Booker Prize, has won the Pulitzer Prize, among other awards, has repeatedly said that Russia has three exports: oil, gas, and fear. Well, we've seen this, all three of these exports coming into focus in the last year. Clearly, Russia made its assessment of what it could do in Ukraine based on the fact that Russia exported a great deal of natural gas and oil to Western Europe, particularly to Germany. And the expectation was the Western powers, particularly in particularly Germany, would accede to whatever Russia wanted to do in Ukraine because of their dependence upon its natural gas. Well, the upshot for the last year is that Russia has been forced to continue trading with Germany and other countries because these countries have found ways to replace the flow of natural gas. Some has come from the United States, others come from the Scandinavian countries, other parts of Europe. According to all the intelligence sources, President Putin, who might as well be called Tsar Vladimir, President Putin calculated that he could get a quick war because there would be no support for Ukraine. Obviously, that has not developed. Interestingly, for the long-term development of geopolitics, President Putin's war in Ukraine has resulted in two of the great historic enemies of Russia, Germany and Japan, rearming. Both countries essentially created defense forces after World War II that they're expanding into what we would call offensive forces now. And that is one of the effects of the war. Russia has miscalculated dramatically. However, will this war continue? Most likely it's going to go on for some time. And that means it's going to, because both sides, both the Ukrainians and the Russians, really have no common ground. Ukraine, of course, has shown the extent of the atrocities committed by the Russian forces. Ukraine has maintained a viable economy despite all odds. It is hard to imagine any kind of settlement that would not be one in which either Ukraine demanded the withdrawal of all Russian forces and reparations and return of Ukrainians, the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have been shipped out of Ukraine to Russia. At the same time, Russia, it undoubtedly would tell Ukraine, we will settle with you if you promise not to join NATO. Now, effectively, Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO already, but the Russians do not want NATO coming any closer to its borders than it is. So the miscalculation of President Putin has meant that this war has gone for certainly much longer than was expected. There are ample reports that the Russian high command expected that they would sweep into Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, in 2 or 3 days. The officers were all instructed to pack their formal uniforms because there's going to be a big parade in Kyiv. I'm sure those uniforms are back in mothballs now. So the war was expected to go very quickly, and that's because the reason it did not go quickly primarily was because of the resolve of the Ukrainians, then the resolve of the Western powers, and this has resulted in probably a stalemated frozen war, which is going to go on for some time. One of the benefits, though, of this war, if you can, even wars do have benefits. One of the benefits of this war has been the resolve of the West. The Western alliance, which had been a little creaky over the last 10 to 20 years, the Western alliance since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 has really been trying to find a purpose. Well, we found a purpose in supporting Ukraine. So Putin has terribly miscalculated. This does not mean that the war is going to end anytime soon. Putin is an absolute monarch. Again, he's often referred to sarcastically in Western countries as Tsar Vladimir. And he has all the characteristics of one of the old Romanov czars. There is no public opposition to him. If you speak out like Navalny, then you end up suddenly having to go to the hospital for poisoning. If you live outside of Russia and you criticize the government, suddenly you fall off of the top of an apartment building, multi-story apartment building. There's no opposition. And Putin lives essentially in a bubble in which people tell him exactly what he wants to hear. So this struggle is going to go on. So that's the first area I want to talk about. Secondly, the second area I want to talk about is China. China is the world's second largest economy. The projections have been recently that it would exceed the U.S. economy in total gross domestic product sometime in the next 30 years. The decline in both the population of China and GDP seems the pace at which GDP is increasing has lent many analysts are convinced now that China will not exceed the U.S. economy for maybe 50 more years. But certainly it's the second largest economy in the world. On a per capita basis, it is not. On a per capita basis, Japan still has the world's most efficient economy. But China is very powerful. It has a very powerful military, which keeps rattling its sabers about taking control of Formosa or Taiwan, formerly the Republic of China. China has been very supportive of Russia and the war in Ukraine. For a couple of reasons. Russia and China both believe that the Western democracies, that the Western style of government and economics and social life are decadent, are corrupt, and that Russia and China have much better systems. And so China has been supportive of Russia, at least initially was very supportive of Russia in the invasion of the Ukraine. However, at the most recent meeting between Putin and President Xi Jinping, President Xi of China, the Chinese president was much more regarded in what he said about support. Initially, back February, March of last year, it seemed like China was even offering, might even offer military support for the Russians. Now they've backed off, and in effect they're saying, we'll be glad to put our arms around your shoulders and tell you what a great guy you are, but you know, we can read the newspapers as well as you can, and we can probably read them in more languages than you can. So this relationship between Russia and China continues to be, at least on the surface, a friendly one. And part of that also has to do with the Chinese interest in getting cheap oil from Russia, and also providing, also in exporting cheap coal to Russia. Russia has a lot of coal interest in the southern Russia, but China is has the world's biggest supply of coal. And much of it, many of its plants are still coal-fired plants. And China has been very reluctant to make that change, because to convert to cleaner sources would be pretty expensive, and the attitude is, if we keep mining coal, then this keeps a lot of our rural population employed. And if they're not employed, that might be a source of instability. So Russia and China have this relationship, which is a peculiar one, because Russia and China have been at odds with each other for hundreds of years. In 1949, when China became a communist state, the People's Republic of China, for about 11 years, there was a very close relationship between the Soviet Union, the leading communist power, and China. However, there was a schism, a split between Mao Zedong and Nikita Khrushchev in 1960. In 1969, in the 60s, there were frequent border clashes between Russian forces and Chinese forces, something that had gone on in the 19th century between the Chinese Empire and the Russian Empire. So this newfound friendship does not have any roots. Russia and China are still essentially countries that have always been opponents of each other, and they may have found an accommodation for the time being. And how deep that accommodation goes is anybody's guess, because China, again, recognizes that Russia is not doing a particularly good job in Ukraine. China also is very concerned about maintaining, at least, even though they consider the West to be corrupt, maintaining good relations with the West for a couple of reasons. One, China wants to continue buying debt from the United States. The U.S. Treasury bills and notes and bonds are the most stable source of investment in the world. The U.S. dollar is still the reserve currency in the world, the mighty dollar. The Chinese still needed to fortify their reserve currency, their reserves in the Bank of China, the Central Bank of China. And the United States and China trade. We have a lot of trade. So China wants to flex its muscles. China wants to show that it can, that it has a superior system to the West. It's willing to do deals with Russia, but there's a limit. There's a limit to what they can do, and that is influenced in part by energy issues and also by trade issues. And of course, trade can involve any number of products. The third area I want to talk about is Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, where you can be publicly executed for criticizing the government. The Iranians have come up with a particularly delightful way of executing people in public. They suspend them by the neck from construction cranes. Really classy. So Iran, of course, has been at loggerheads with the West since 1979. 1973, of course, we had the very dramatic Yom Kippur Arab oil embargo, which gasoline prices literally overnight went from 25 cents a gallon to 50 cents a gallon. I know I'd do anything to buy gasoline for 50 cents a gallon right now, but when you double price, you really affect consumers. So 73, gas prices doubled almost literally overnight. In 79, after the Islamic Republic was established and Iran wanted to punish the United States and other Western powers for trying to take care of the cancer-ridden Shah of Iran, they boosted prices, but that was relatively small. That was it only resulted in about a 5% increase in oil prices, and that was dissipated fairly rapidly. Iran is not so much interested in oil exports as it is in developing nuclear power, and by nuclear power, at least officially, that means building nuclear reactors, but what it really means is building a nuclear force. Now, I don't want to stand in support of the Ayatollahs, but there is some reason for Iran to consider, to feel that there's a necessity to build a nuclear deterrent force. And that is because of their continuing conflict, maybe even deepening conflict with Israel. The state of Israel, as everybody knows, but no one publicly acknowledges, has nuclear weapons. Most likely they're seaborne, they're in submarines. And the distance between the Eastern Mediterranean and downtown Tehran is pretty short. So the thinking in the thinking of the Iranians is, well, we have a nation with which we have been in conflict at least since 1979, and they have nuclear weapons. Why can't we have nuclear weapons? Now, the negotiations between Iran and the Western powers, particularly the United States and even Russia, have been going on for 10 to 15 years, and they wax and wane. They're a very lousy state right now. Iran increasingly, the incentives, it appeared at one point that the United States and the Europeans and the Russians were going to offer enough incentives to Iran so that they would ease back on, that they would give up a nuclear deterrent program, and they would only use the enriching uranium and those types of activities in order to build nuclear power plants and use nuclear power for peaceful purposes. That seems to have gone away. And this creates this energy factor creates problems for the West. Two things have happened. The Iranians are clearly, the Ayatollahs, the government of Iran is increasingly hardline. You can see this in the attacks on demonstrators, the public executions where people have criticized the government, engaged in what was considered treasonous activities. And at the same time, we now have a very hardline government again in Israel under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who actually lived many years in the United States and actually speaks English with a kind of New Jersey accent. But I went to graduate school in New Jersey, so I'd like to hear that. But Netanyahu, now back in power, which also has prevented him from being indicted, being put on trial, or continuing on trial on corruption charges, has made it very clear that if the West is not willing, does not come to some accommodation, does not come to some settlement with Iran, then Israel holds the right to engage in assaults, in military action against Iranian nuclear development facilities. Much as they did in 1984. In 1984, the Israeli government sent fighter jets that blew the bejabbers out of Saddam Hussein's center for nuclear development. The problem is Iran reads history just like everybody else, and they have most likely so fortified or buried these facilities that any overt attack, short of using nuclear weapons from those Israeli submarines, probably would not have any effect. But this is an area, Iran continues to be an area in which we have a very unfortunate intersection of energy and geopolitics. Iran is an ancient country. It goes back to, of course, the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire existed a couple of thousand years ago. So you're looking at a nation with a very long tradition, a belief that they are as entitled to a strong position in the Middle East as any other country, that they have the economic, political, and military strength to do so, that they have the tradition behind it. And they certainly want to eliminate the Israeli state, the Jewish state of Israel. But they also would like to see the elimination of Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is a Muslim country, but it is Sunni Muslim, which represent about 90% of all Muslims in the world, about 1 billion Muslims in the world. About 900 million of them are Sunni. The other 100 million, or 10%, are Shiites. And Iran is the great Shiite country. The entire population of Iran is Shiite. And so these two conflicts are just like the conflicts in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s in Europe between Protestant nations and Roman Catholic nations. And Iran would like, in part, Iran believes that it needs to build up a nuclear deterrent, and they're willing to use their energy policy and economic policy as a deterrent against what they perceive as a threat not only from Israel, but also a threat from Saudi Arabia. So that's a quick view of 3 areas in which energy and geopolitics have intersected. The fourth, the overriding policy factor, if you want to call it that I want to end this talk with, is climate change. The major nations, the major industrial nations of the world have entered into a series of agreements, most recently the Paris climate talks, which set goals for reducing the emissions of carbon emissions, reducing hothouse or greenhouse gases, which have increased the world temperature. The world temperature clearly is going up. This is resulting in, we've already seen it in catastrophic weather conditions in various parts of the world. Great Britain had the hottest Christmas season in its history in 2022. You know the stories as well as I do. The idea of these accords is that the major industrial powers, in cooperation with developing nations like Bangladesh, for instance, Pakistan, even India, will reduce greenhouse gases, but that means a dramatic reduction in the use of fossil fuels, that is primarily coal and oil. Now there's some problems there. It's one thing to go to Paris, and who wouldn't want to go to Paris for a conference? It's one thing to go to Paris and for China, for instance, to sign onto the Paris Climate Accords, and then go back to China and tell the people in Western China, sorry, got to lay you off. We're not going to do any more coal. We're going to plant a lot of wind turbines, and we're going to use solar power, and yeah, you all have a nice life. Well, that's probably not going to work. Now, in some countries like the United States is actually, if you look at our history from, again, 10 cents a gallon gasoline in Midland, Texas in the 1950s to today, the United States has done a remarkable job over a fairly short period of time in economic terms of adjusting to the world economy. And we're increasingly doing that. You just watch, I spend too much time watching television, but you see ads for Cadillac, which is saying we're producing an all-electric vehicle. Domino's Pizza is saying all our delivery vans will now be electric powered. It just goes on and on and on. So we're making pretty good adjustments. And if any country could satisfy that intersection of energy and geopolitics, it would be the United States, also Western Europe. But countries like India are still very dependent on coal-fired plants. China is still dependent. And we also have countries which still are very dependent on oil, particularly countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which are emerging into what we call middle-class economies. But they're willing to, they need oil because other types of renewable energy are simply not available. It's one thing to have wind turbines and go out to my home area of West Texas. You can see on that, remember, you can see forever and ever. You can't see much, but you can see a lot of it. In West Texas, you see all these wind turbines. It's great to have these wind turbines, but how do you connect them so that it runs the electricity in somebody's house in Fort Worth or Wichita Falls or El Paso or anywhere? Now, these grids are being created. But in sub-Saharan Africa, these grids don't exist. And how can they exist without relatively cheap investments from Western powers? There are some exceptions. South Africa, the Republic of South Africa is getting into this renewable sources. India is starting this. The problem in India is you have a Hindu nationalist party, the BJP, under Prime Minister Modi, who is more concerned about ethnic cleansing than it is about economic policies. So, climate change affects everybody. It affects people all over the world. And the effects of it are are increasingly apparent. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country, is going to be closed in the next few years, and the capital is going to be moved They're going to move 20 million people. I don't know how they plan to do that, but they're going to close the Capitol because it's literally sinking. Now there are some efforts to try to replenish, restore the foundation, the land foundation of Jakarta, but it's probably not going to work. Bangladesh is the fastest growing economy in Asia. It's increasing between 7% and 14% a year. That's what China used to do, but of course it has a more mature economy. That's great, except that much of Bangladesh, much of the coastal Bangladesh, is going to be underwater in the next 10 to 20 years. Very dramatic. So the real concern at the intersection of geopolitics and energy is not so much about how long the war in Ukraine lasts, or how solid the friendship between Russia and China is, or what India is willing to do to help Russia, or what Iran is willing to do in making accommodations on nuclear power. It's really the issue that affects all of us, and that is climate change. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic? Depends on the person you talk to. Some people, some advocates believe that in fact the world's making enough changes that we're going to at least avoid the most drastic effects of climate change. Others think that we're going to have to go through a very debilitating period of climate change before there can be a settlement, before there can be some kind of resolution. So there's a famous Chinese expression, a famous Chinese curse: may you live in interesting times. And so we are. All right, any questions? Yes, sir, Judge.
Dr. Stein, you talked about on climate change. We see in Europe, they have kind of cut back on some of their green energy goals because of the not taking in the Russian oil and gas. Have you seen any reports that show, because like Germans are burning more coal, and the French are doing a lot more nuclear and all that? Have you seen any reports that show how many years the Ukrainian war has set back climate change goals, like for the Paris Accords?
Very good question. It's probably, the Russian invasion has probably set back any real efforts at controlling climate change, or even ameliorating the effects of climate change. The thinking, I know enough to get myself in trouble about this subject. The general thinking is that we can reduce the effects of climate change, that we can't reverse it, but we can reduce the effects. So I've seen estimates of anywhere between a few years and 10 to 20 years of reversal. Now, one interesting development, Judge, you've brought up a good point. Germany is now rethinking nuclear power. Germany had closed, I think, almost all of its nuclear power plants. Now it's looking at reopening them. Of course, nuclear power creates a lot of waste, much of which in the United States is shipped out to my old part of the country, West Texas, out to Andrews County, where it's buried very deep, but that creates problems. So in the United States, there has been talk about developing new nuclear power plants. Of course, the problem there is, I give you three names: 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, the three nuclear disasters since the 1970s. However, in fairness, nuclear power, the safeguards of nuclear power, especially since the tsunami that almost destroyed the Fukushima nuclear plant a few years ago have increased. And certainly we know more about it. 3 Mile Island's a lot safer. It's still in operation. Chernobyl, of course, was utter disaster, but that was a Russian project. And the Russians, they make a great soup called borscht, but and they write great operas, but you know, there's a limit to their scientific abilities. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has had worldwide implications, including because it was so tied to energy, also included trying to deal with climate change.
So you're thinking maybe, the reports you've seen, maybe 2 to 20 years?
Yeah, 2 to 20 years. Some report, The Economist, the British publication, does some terrific work reporting on this, and they're more optimistic. They're more optimistic that because of simple conservation, Europe may not need to fire up use as much coal in Germany and France as has been expected. That their conservation efforts may help. That more efficient plants they're more efficient plants. Production might be in place, so there's some hope. Thank you. Good question. Yes, sir.
Not so long ago, Russia and Saudi Arabia had a price war. Was that Russia's precursor to the Ukrainian war? And at the time, I read that Saudi Arabia still only had an expense of $7 a barrel to produce their oil.
Yes, Saudi Arabia still. Judge Worthen and I were talking about this before the session started. At one time, we sat on the world's biggest pool of oil, the East Texas oil field, biggest single pool of oil, until the Saudis discovered one in the 1960s. I think that's the biggest one. They may have found some others. The advantage for Saudi Arabia is that they can still produce oil at a very low price, and the OPEC Plus organization, which includes Russia, is still for the most part dominated by Saudi Arabia. And one of the reasons they can dominate it and set policy is they can reduce, either flood the market or tighten the market, and they're going to make a profit one way or the other. Brent crude is trading around in the 80s. West Texas Intermediate crude is trading around $80. The Saudis could produce oil at, could sell it at $7 a barrel and still make a profit. So Saudi Arabia, and this is one of the reasons that this also inflames the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia also has been supportive of the West in terms of Russia, because they see Russia as a long-term threat to their stability, and their stability is all tied up to world price of oil and stability in the energy sector. The problem with Saudi Arabia is they don't have anything else besides oil, and so pardon.
So does Russia.
Yeah, so does Russia. Yeah, and Russia's running out of it. So does at some point in 50 years, Saudi Arabia. Now the Crown Prince bin Salman has been trying with some success to improve agriculture, but you can't build a wealthy state based only on agriculture, no matter how productive or efficient efficient it is. Has to be part of a larger industrial program, and Saudi Arabia may not be able to do that.
Who initiated the war, though? Who initiated it, Russia or Saudi Arabia?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Sorry, but they don't get along. Yeah.
Question on it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I have two questions.
Sure.
Is there some conflict between Russia and China over Manchuria?
This was, yes, in part it does. Manchuria at different times has been an independent country. Way back in the 1400s, 1300s, 1400s, it was independent, and then it was absorbed into the Chinese Empire. But as the Chinese Empire declined in the 19th century, Russia began building railroads through Manchuria, and this then set off conflict with Japan, because Japan also was looking at taking control of Manchuria. So part of this is still the border war. I think in 1969 was in Manchuria. I think it was between Russia. These border skirmishes were over the border of China. Russia says it's one. It's a river, and China says it's a fixed border on the land.
Don't the communist China want to go into Manchuria and take that?
Well, Manchuria is formally part of the People's Republic of China, but it's been fought over, and the Russians would. There's a lot of coal. There's, I think, some oil. There are a lot of natural resources in Manchuria. So that's still a source of conflict.
The question I had is, how would food supply play out in the countries?
I'm sorry, what would?
How would the food supply in the world play out in different countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia versus the United States?
Very good question. Listen, Saudi Arabia has a fairly small population. If you had substantial disruptions of the supply chain, the countries that you name, probably Saudi Arabia would be the least affected. The problem for the Saudi economy, for the Saudi society, is that this is a very wealthy society. They are not accustomed to any kind of deprivation. And so if there was a large-scale deprivation or cutoff in the supply of goods and services to the Saudis, they might be a little upset with the House of Al Saud. I'm sorry.
They'd have enough money to buy it.
They'd have enough. They wouldn't. Yeah, right. They wouldn't have enough. They might, but there are certain things. If you don't, if you can't buy that which doesn't exist, so that might be a problem. The United States, we have a relatively secure system. Of course, we saw the supply chain problems as a result of the pandemic. We would probably be able to adapt pretty well. Russia, no. Russia would be in a terrible position.
Unless China's bought up most of the...
Unless China intervened in that.
We have about 20% of our farmland now?
I don't know. That's agricultural economics. Yeah, I slept through that class. I'm sorry. Sorry. Good.
I'm afraid we've run out of time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
One more question.
Yeah, one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to Czar Vladimir, if his sole concern was about NATO,
Yes.
then what is the expectations now that Finland and Norway have submitted their paperwork to become members of NATO so that they can draw on NATO to help cover their borders with Russia?
This has been an extraordinary miscalculation by Tsar Vladimir. Finland and Sweden are in the process of joining NATO. Ukraine is going to go into NATO at some point, whether Russia wants it or not. The fear of Russia has, for centuries, for thousands of years, has been encirclement, and so what is happening is just going to those actions will just feed that fear and just feed the paranoia of Russia. And the wounded Russian bear is a dangerous animal.
You don't think that he will try to save faith and somehow come to an agreement to...
I don't see how he can back down. Any effort to save face would require that he back down, and so much of his personality is he's not a man who compromises, and he hasn't had to. I mean, he's been effectively in power for 20 years. Mm-hmm. He's got $40 billion stored away in various places. He's got a nice dacha, nice house, lodge, a ski lodge in Switzerland. Supposedly that's where he would escape with his mistress and their children.
Unless the Russians turn on him.
Unless the Russians turn on him. But there's no organized opposition. There would have to be...
Anybody that even thinks about it.
I'm sorry?
I said he kills off anybody.
He kills off anybody who gets in the way, unless there was some kind of massive coup. Right. I mean, there's still the possibility of a palace coup. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was wonderful, as always.
Thank you.
And join us next week on the 25th at noon when I will be the one speaking on China and the United States. So hope to see you back in 7 days, and have a good one.
Thank you. Good job. Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey.